Hi, folks. Ryan Denton here. So today, obviously, we're dealing with a controversial issue. The purpose of this video is not to be intentionally controversial. It's an important topic. I think it needs to be brought up and discussed and analyzed, especially through the lens of Scripture and just the practicality of certain things. But I do want to preface this by saying two things. First of all, this video is not to denigrate women. The Scriptures most definitely teach that women and men are equal when it comes to value, worth, dignity, importance, but they have different roles and functions. And anytime we deviate from those biblical structures, whether it's in the church, the home, society, or like we're talking about today on the streets, things happen, problems arise. And so that's one of the things I do want to point out. This is not to say that women have some kind of lesser place or anything like that, but they have a different ministry. They have a different role. Now, secondly, this is not to say that women have no place at all when it comes to evangelism. In fact, the opposite is very much the case. Women are very important when it comes to evangelism. All Christians, we're all called to evangelize. We're all called to gospelize, to share what we know about Christ to others, to teach in the lowercase t sense of the word, to teach others what we know about Jesus Christ. And so that includes women. Anybody who names the name, we're all called to do that. Now, the 5 reasons, I have 5 reasons, and the first 2 reasons, in a sense, they go together as far as why it is that women should not street preach. And the first reason is because of that word preach. Now, the word preach, caruso, in the Scriptures, there's a sense in which that word is what it is it's a lifting your voice like a trumpet. It's a heralding a certain message, in this case, the gospel message, but it's a formal proclamation. It's an authoritative proclamation. In other words, it's not casual. It's not just conversational. It's not one-on-one stuff. This is talking about a different type of ministry altogether, in the sense of we are talking about a word ministry, a preaching ministry, and that leads me to the reason number 2. And that's because in 1 Timothy 2, Paul says something to the effect that he does not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. Now, I understand that a lot of times people say, well, this is just for the church setting. Now, yes and no, I would say, because yes, in the sense that Paul is specifically talking about the church here, but no, in the sense of when he's speaking about this word teach or have authority over man or men, he's talking about teaching in an official capacity, in an authoritative capacity. And so when you're on the streets, preaching on the streets, this is different from going to the streets and just sharing the gospel one-on-one, because again of that word caruso, and here when it comes to preaching, there's a formal aspect of preaching that in teaching that Paul is talking about here. So in other words, this is teach with a capital T. But also, here's the thing too, when it comes to the I guess the who of street preaching, who should be doing it. I think we're all aware of people that we've seen or that we're aware of that should not be street preaching. Now, here's the question. Who should we look to as far as vetting, sending out, training, equipping when it comes to preaching? Let's say in the pulpit. Well, we would look at the church, right? What about in the streets? The streets, in a sense, should be the same thing when it comes to training, when it comes to equipping, when it comes to sending, things like this, because this is a formal ministry. This is an authoritative ministry. This is a word ministry. And so because of that, it's the church. Now, I understand that this is ideal and more importantly, this is biblical, as far as the church should be the one who are raising people up, training people, and sending them out to preach in the open air. I'm very aware of the fact that most churches are not doing this. Many churches are in fact, they're probably so much against open air preaching or street preaching, they would not even authorize Charles Spurgeon or the Apostle Paul to go and preach on the streets. That is true, but that does not mean that we should just be able to go to the streets and start preaching willy-nilly, without any kind of authority, without any kind of backing, without any kind of structure involved. Ideally, biblically, that should not happen. Now, if that's the case, then the church has to use certain measures to be able to determine who should be preaching. Because quite frankly, again, we've all encountered people that should not be preaching. whether they're not good preachers, or whether it's a maturity thing. And so, see, the church is going to be the best situation as far as qualifying people to do this, ideally, because again, I would argue that street preaching is an authoritative, it's a formal, it's an official, it should be an official ministry, as far as this being a word ministry, a preaching ministry, a teaching ministry, in the same sense of someone standing in front of a classroom at church or in the pulpit at church in preaching. That there should be an element to this where we shouldn't just thrust anybody into that situation. But here's the thing, okay? If as a church we're trying to determine, well, who should be the one that should preach, or the ones who should preach? Well, we have to first and foremost, we want to see if they're qualified as far as biblical maturity goes. And when we do this, we're going to look to places like 1 Timothy 3 or Titus 1, where you have an outline or the qualifications for an elder. Now, not all street preachers are going to be elders. It's not saying that you have to be an elder if you're going to go preach on the streets. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that the qualifications there in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, those are qualifications for mature Christians. So in other words, not just because you have those qualifications doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be an elder, but it does mean that you are a mature Christian, and as Christians, that's what we should be aiming at. And as street preachers, that's definitely what we should be aiming at. And of course, the qualification in there, one of those qualifications, that we're married to one wife. Now, I'm not saying that you have to be married to anybody, but I'm saying that it's this gender specific situation. Now, that being the case, here's the other thing: you want to be able to see if the person can even preach. Right? Before you just, now you can I guess you can assess that on the streets. That's fine too. But the reality is you want to be able to determine if the person can preach or not, because a lot of times people are preaching. They might be a biblically mature Christian, but they're not a good preacher, right? Just like certain guys, they should be in the pulpit preaching. Same thing on the streets. There's a lot of mishandling as far as who should be preaching, who is preaching. Now, I'm aware, again, of the exceptions out there, that this is a sticky issue in the sense of not every church is ever going to be perfect, and not every scenario is going to be perfect. However, it is to say that there should be some kind of qualification, something that we can go by as far as an outline or a guideline when it comes to who should be on the streets preaching. And I would say that it's the qualifications of an elder, and it's also people who have the gifting of preaching, of teaching. Now, because that's what you're doing on the streets, right? Now, here's the thing, okay? Even if you disagree with that, and I know some people will say, well, now but here's the thing. Even if you disagree with that, when you look in Scripture, okay, because this is going to be the third reason, is because in Scripture there is no precedence. There are no examples of women preaching on the streets. When Jesus sends out the 70 disciples, there are no women in that bunch. In fact, so women are with Jesus, but they're ministering to Jesus. So they're there. They're important. They're very important, but they have a different role and function than the men who are sent out, the 70 disciples who are sent out to preach and to do miracles, cast out demons, and things like that. Now, even in the book of Acts, what you have is you have Paul, and you do have women that Paul mentions in some of his letters, and women are there to help the ministry. And so again, they're important. Women are very important, but they're not out there preaching. You'll never find any woman preaching on the streets with the apostles. And the closest you get is something like Priscilla and Aquila, when they take Apollos aside and they teach him more correctly, more accurately about the things of the gospel. Now, even in this instance, though, they're not street preaching. They're not on the side of the street corner. They're not on a street corner preaching to Apollos. They take him aside. They're teaching him. They're telling him these things in a very informal, probably casual, certainly a conversational kind of way. And so again, it shows us that yes, women are very important when it comes to evangelism, but when it comes to street preaching, open air preaching, there's no precedence. There's no examples in the Bible that show us this or even hint at this. Now, here's the other thing, okay? Physically, okay, a woman, according to Scripture, is to have a gentle and a quiet spirit, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. That's a mark of that's a wonderful quality for women to have, because God has created women to have that quality, to have those qualities. Now, A gentle and quiet spirit is the very opposite, by definition, of lifting your voice like a trumpet. Going back to our first definition of carousal or preaching, right? Lifting your voice like a trumpet, by definition, is not going to be a gentle and quiet spirit. Now, I'm not saying that street preachers should be confrontational in the sense of boisterous, arrogantly boisterous, into disputes and things like that. But it is to say that a woman is not built physically, and they're not designed in the capacity that men are designed for, especially for the purpose of going out and lifting your voice like a trumpet. They're built differently. They have they have different gifts. They have different roles. They have different functions. And so even practically speaking now, this is what we're talking, practically speaking, they're not built for this. The Bible calls women weaker vessels, and that's not derogatory. That's just to say that when it comes to physical, emotional capacities, they're not going to be able to do certain things as well as, let's say, a man. Now, that does, again, here, it does not mean, now, because women, this does not mean that you are somehow inferior when it comes to your value, your worth, your importance, your dignity, all these things. You're very important, even when it, especially when it comes to evangelism. We need women out there helping and evangelizing themselves. That's very important. That's very critical. So it's not to say that they're useless, even when it comes to evangelism, but it is to say that their disposition, both physically and emotionally, is different, and they're not called for this kind of ministry. They're not called to do this kind of ministry. And then lastly, aside from those reasons, and you could argue this one, but Charles Spurgeon. Now, we all know Charles Spurgeon was an incredible genius. He had a real knack and insight for certain things, and whenever he discussed women preaching, he referenced a quote from a man named Dr. Johnson, who lived before Spurgeon. But the quote that Spurgeon alluded to approvingly goes like this. So when Boswell, a man named Boswell, told Dr. Johnson one day that he had heard a woman preach that morning at a Quakers meeting, Johnson replied, "Sir, a woman preaching is like a dog walking on its hind legs." Now, this is not to say women are dogs. It's not to say that this woman preacher is a dog. It's to say that a dog is not to walk on its hind legs. That's unnatural. That's unorthodox. It looks funny. It's not right. It goes against nature, right? And so a dog walking on its hind legs goes against nature. Spurgeon is saying this is kind of how it is when a woman preaches. Now, you can say, well, that's just subjective, that's just relative, that's just an opinion. And in a sense, on this part, I would agree. But I would have to disagree that it's incorrect. Because here's the thing. Theologically, practically, and now even, I would say, subjectively, there's something that goes against nature when a woman preaches. Now, again, here's the thing, okay? Women are very important when it comes to ministry, when it comes to evangelism. But here's the thing too. I think for men, right? There are men who should be out there preaching who are not preaching. And there are churches who should be equipping and helping men to get onto the streets, and they're not doing it. Because for whatever reason, they're not seeing the validity of a ministry like street preaching. And what happens is because there is a gap in out there, there's a tendency in certain people to say, well, because the church isn't doing it, I have to step up and I have to do it, even if it goes against Scripture, even if it's not practical, and even if it goes against nature. And that's what you have a lot of times when women go out and street preach, and that's their excuse, that's their justification. And I would say that just because the men are failing to do so, the churches are not stepping up in many cases. Many churches are, but in many churches that's not the case. It does not give the license to anybody to go against what Scripture says and shows, and what Scripture, practicality, what that shows, and even what goes against nature. So here's the thing. Men and churches, we also have to step up, and we also have to fill in the gap, go and preach on the streets. Those who are called, those who are equipped, get out there and preach on the streets, man. Churches, be equipping people to go out there and preach on the streets. Women, ladies, go out and help. And I tell you, I mean, the one-on-one conversations are some of the best fruit that take place when it comes to street preaching. So go out there and help out the guys who are street preaching. And if there are no guys who are street preaching, go out there and you can still have one-on-one conversations. Those are fruitful. Those are needed. But lastly, I want to say this. There are also a lot of men who should not be preaching on the streets. For whatever reason, whether it's because they can't preach or perhaps they're not quite mature enough. And so that needs to be addressed. But what we're talking about right now is women street preaching and why they should not be street preaching. Again, theologically it's not there. Even biblically, just looking for biblical examples, it's not there. Practically, it's not there, and it goes against nature. So those are my reasons. I understand. I'm sure there'll be a lot of disputing that and a lot of disagreement. But here's the thing: if you do, I mean, I'm more than willing. I really do want to hear your opinion on this because it is a controversial and difficult topic. And I think it's a very important topic. I'm sure you do too if you're watching this video. So let's discuss this. Let's look at it. Let's use the Bible to figure it out. And let's go and see what the Lord shows us and see what happens from here. So I hope this is helpful, and God bless.